Welcome everyone, welcome to the First Monday Forum. As you just heard, this is a collaboration between the Public Diplomacy Council of America, the USC Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership and Policy, and of course, George Washington University's Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. Now, some of you may already know this, but I am compelled to emphasize that at the Elliott School, our mission is to educate the next generation of international leaders. The second piece of our mission is to conduct research that advances public understanding of important global issues. And the third part of our mission is to engage the policy community in the United States and around the world. You can see how all three of those pieces come together in a conversation like today's. The Public Diplomacy Council of America and our Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communications have a history that goes back more than 20 years. Our partnership is based on the common goal to facilitate the sharing of ideas about public diplomacy practice and theory, bringing together experts and practitioners in the field of public diplomacy for discussions exactly like this. The Elliott School is honored to host these monthly gatherings, very happy to be back in person this semester, and to share insights and best practices, and to introduce the work of public diplomacy to our students, who will be tomorrow's Foreign Service officers and diplomats. I was so happy to find out that today's speaker is Assistant Secretary Lee Satterfield, who heads the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. She is responsible for overseeing the State Department's efforts to engage individuals across the globe through academic, cultural, professional, sports, and youth exchanges. Before joining the State Department, Ms. Satterfield held a variety of leadership positions in the public and nonprofit sectors. As the President and Chief Operating Officer at Meridian International Center, just up the street, up 16th Street, she directed daily operations and spearheaded major strategic initiatives to strengthen engagement between the United States and the world. I know some of our Elliott School students have gone on to internships and to employment at the Meridian International Center, so very happy to remind students here, give them a look. She also served earlier in the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, and in the Clinton administration in several senior positions, including as Chief of Staff to Secretary Alexis Herman at the Labor Department, and as Special Assistant to the President and Staff Director for the White House Office of Public Liaison. Ms. Satterfield is a distinguished leader who has demonstrated a lifelong commitment to public service and diplomacy, and we are so honored to have you with us today. Welcome, Assistant Secretary Satterfield, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with us all today. Thank you.
Good morning. Or is it afternoon? I guess it's afternoon, a couple minutes afternoon. How is everybody? Good to see you in person, and welcome to those who are joining us online. Thank you for that kind introduction, and congratulations being the first female to serve in your distinguished role, the Elliott School for International Affairs here at GW. And I will echo something that you said. Some of the students that I had a chance to work with at Meridian from GW were the best and brightest that I've had an opportunity to engage with. So I would encourage more of the students to look at Meridian, but all of the public diplomacy practitioners out in the world with all of our State Department partners. So please take advantage of that. I also want to acknowledge our host, the Public Diplomacy Council of America. You are doing such important work and continuing to make sure that this field of study remains relevant, and that we bring together groups like this to convene with one another to talk about how we can further the impact of public diplomacy. George Washington University Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communications is part of the host, and USC's Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Public Diplomacy. So well done, all of those organizations, for continuing to make this a monthly practice so that we can come together. Also want to welcome our State Department partners who are here today. So many of you, thank you for your partnership in implementing the important work that we do in public diplomacy at State. On behalf of President Biden and Secretary Blinken, I'm honored to be with you here today, both in person and online, and I'm happy to see so many students who are taking part of the program as well, where we can get a chance to encourage you to look into the field of public diplomacy. In a world where change is constant, especially on the international stage, I think today's topic, public diplomacy, is a strategic imperative and matters more now than ever, is critically important. As President Biden asserted in the National Security Strategy, the United States Foreign Policy Roadmap, that's what that is, a nation's power springs from its people. Indeed it does. In fact, I'll take it a step further. Every aspect of U.S. foreign policy, defense, diplomacy, and development has an underlying reliance on people-to-people engagement. Historically, we've witnessed examples of this: the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of apartheid, the AIDS epidemic, the Arab Spring, natural disasters, and so much more. As each of these events prove, progress is not possible without the trust and support of the people both at home and abroad. This brings people-to-people diplomacy front and center. Whether it was South Africans standing up to apartheid or Tunisians organizing across social media platforms, at the heart of these movements, people came together, armed with hope, know-how, and the simple belief in more peace and prosperity for all, to change the trajectory of history. Today, almost 35 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and apartheid, and nearly 15 years since the Arab Spring, we're now faced with new unprecedented challenges that we haven't faced since World War II era. Just like the Greatest Generation, we're on the heels of a global pandemic, war in Europe, and nations under autocratic and communist rule aim to outpace the United States as the global superpower. It was under these circumstances that 75 years ago, the United States began in earnest to formally use public diplomacy as a foreign policy tool. Jazz ambassadors, the Fulbright program, the Fulbright-Hays Act that coined the term mutual understanding, were born from this era and are foundational to our modern-day public diplomacy approach. The linear connections between then and now validate President Biden's approach to foreign policy as we navigate what he calls this decisive decade, where it will be determined who will shape the future of the world, nations who share our democratic values or nations who do not. In fact, within the Biden-Harris administration's national security strategy, there are key components that drive action collectively through policy and public diplomacy every single day: strengthening democracy, promoting global economic stability, and competing with those actors and nations who are in direct conflict with our American values. Where the national security strategy states, as we create the conditions for our people to thrive, we'll also continue to make America the destination of choice for talent around the world. That's where the work we all do together to support international student mobility and international education takes center stage. As the 2022 Open Doors Report outlined, the United States remains the top destination for international students globally. International student mobility infuses an additional $32 billion into the American economy and supports nearly 300,000 American jobs. International education is one of our top 10 exports. We recognize and appreciate the value and impact international students bring to our classrooms and our campuses and our communities, which is why we're doubling down to boost those numbers even more through increased investment in Education USA, our global advising network that supports international student mobility. But that's only half of the equation. Recognizing the impact the global health pandemic had on our American students, We're working closely with the U.S. colleges and universities to increase the number of Americans who study abroad, with the aim of exceeding pre-pandemic levels. For students of color, first-generation college students, community college students, and students with limited financial means, study abroad may feel out of reach. This is our moment as study abroad reemerges, to ensure that study abroad becomes even more accessible to every student who seeks that life-changing opportunity. And just so you know, I'm doing my own part to increase these numbers. My youngest son, Connor, who's a junior at the University of Miami in Florida, is about to wrap up a semester abroad in Barcelona, Spain. He is an exchange student himself. I hope his classroom education is on par with his cultural education, which I can tell from his social media footprint that it's going well. Where the National Security Strategy outlines how COVAX, the global effort to deploy vaccinations around the world, is supporting global public health, the United States is promoting our J1 exchange visitors, now called Bridge USA, to bring international researchers together with their American counterparts in the U.S. to pursue a cure for COVID-19. When President Biden speaks out against Russia's brutal efforts to destroy Ukraine, this is where our cultural heritage efforts come to the forefront. Far from the headlines of tanks and fighter jets is Russia's destruction of Ukraine's cultural heritage and identity, which gets to the heart of Russia's unjust war. The United States' efforts to preserve and protect these cultural sites and artifacts, which we're spearheading through our recent launch of the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Response Initiative, which sends a strong signal, not just to the Kremlin, but to transnational criminal organizations, traffickers, and corrupt art dealers, that we will stand up to those who aim to destroy, damage, or steal cultural heritage around the world. These responses we've seen to our cultural heritage preservation and protection efforts, not just from the leaders in Ukraine, but also the impact of State Department supported preservation projects that I've seen firsthand on visits in Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, to name a few. They're the underpinning and the importance of our people-to-people diplomacy work. Front and center to our national security strategy is the reality that we are in this post-Cold War posture. As a complement to our broader defense and development work around the world, our public diplomacy footprint continues to modernize and grow around the world, with nearly 700 American spaces outfitted across the globe so that the United States can be present, not just for a transactional moment in time, but for the long haul. As many of you know, American spaces are open access learning and gathering places around the world that promote interaction between local communities and the United States. Our Education USA advising centers are often located there and help recruit and support international students to study in the United States. In October last year, we announced a new partnership with Google to conduct a series of workforce and media literacy trainings, both in Vietnam and Indonesia, at our American spaces. In Vietnam, local entrepreneurs participated in a boot camp style curriculum run by experts from Google, addressing everyday challenges such as how to build a business, access capital, and more. In Indonesia, again with Google as our private sector partner, we use the American space to work with young leaders on media literacy, how to combat online misinformation, and how to navigate the internet. The goal is to equip more than 1,000 trainers with new skills and materials, thereby enabling them to provide training to more than 100,000 Indonesians across the spectrum of both age and internet expertise over the next 2 years. Impressive. While I'm certain that our core value of mutual understanding has been seeded and is growing, it's these type of public diplomacy programs and investments that support our broader foreign policy goals. I've outlined a few of our key priorities: cultural heritage, American spaces, education, global health, as they pertain to the national security strategy. You'll notice today that I'm not carving out a special section of my speech just to focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. That's because everything we do at the department and in our public diplomacy program has DEIA embedded into the program design and program implementation. Representation matters, and if people here at home and abroad can see it, then they can surely believe it. The Biden administration will continue to embed DEIA into all of our foreign policy efforts to ensure that it lasts well beyond a term in office, a trend, or a news cycle. As Secretary Blinken often says, our diversity is one of our greatest strengths. I agree and will continue to leverage DEIA in all that we do. In addition to outlining a few key priorities, I want to share with you how our approach now is more purposefully pronounced going forward. Earlier, I shared how the post-World War II era, the Fulbright-Hays Act was implemented to create mutual understanding between people of the United States and people of other nations and territories. Today, I will put forward that as part of a broader effort to modernize the department, mutual understanding is not only our legislative directive and our foundation, our guiding force, if you will, it is also our springboard and our catalyst to pursue and achieve U.S. foreign policy priorities. Now, you might be asking, what does that mean exactly? I would encourage you to take a hard look at Vice President Kamala Harris's recent trip to Ghana, Tanzania, and Zambia. Instead of using the historic playbook that focused on the impact of deadly diseases or poverty, the United States has opted to showcase how it is a partner to African nations, working together to realize the full potential of both of our nations in a true two-way partnership that benefits all of our people. In Tanzania, the United States' first Black female vice president was out in the community, learning about how women entrepreneurs are taking ECA-led workforce development trainings and applying them to building and growing their small businesses through the Academy of Women Entrepreneurs and a private sector partnership with Arizona State University's Thunderbird School of Global Management. Or in Ghana, where the vice president announced a new opportunity to boost the creative economy through ECA's One Beat musical exchange program, which uses the power of music as a gateway to engage youth, but also rejuvenate local economies. Now, through One Beat, Ghanaian artists can better pursue business strategies that support the creative economy and enhance their networks in the music industry. Both examples showcase how the department uses our foundational value of mutual understanding to engage in people-to-people diplomacy, but we aren't stopping there. We're taking it to the next level to purposefully and strategically show how in these specific examples, people are better able to pursue economic stability, economic equality, and economic accessibility, all key aspects of the national security strategy approach to U.S. engagement with Africa. While I'm so proud to share all the work currently in the pipeline and on the front lines of presidential and vice presidential travel, I also want to highlight a different angle of impact thanks to our exchanges. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the power generated from our exchange alumni. For more than 80 years, nearly 2 million people, including 500,000 American citizens, have participated in U.S.-sponsored or supported exchanges. Our exchange alumni go on to become the leaders in government, business, and civil society. And if I may humble brag for a moment, nearly 700 current or former heads of state and government and almost 90 Nobel Peace Prize winners are part of our exchange alumni network. When we talk about public diplomacy and the next big thing, we talk about amazing work and impact our exchange alumni have all around the world. As you know, the modernization of public diplomacy programs have been driven both by the state of our world and the audience we seek to serve and reach. For over 3 years now, as part of our daily life was driven by the COVID-19 global health pandemic. As we both lived through and now emerge from COVID-19, I wanted to share that public servants and public diplomacy practitioners like those in this room and those who make up the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs continue to navigate, innovate, and engage through people-to-people diplomacy in new ways. Yes, our traditional in-person exchanges were paused in many cases, though there were a few that continued, such as the Fulbright program that had 4,000 international students and scholars in the United States who continued their programs in universities. It ranged from in-person, hybrid, to virtual. Thanks to our Bridge USA team, there were nearly 50,000 J1 exchange visitors in 2020 and nearly 130,000 in 2021, which included foreign physicians and researchers who were on the front lines of combating COVID-19. I know it's easy for me to rattle off a few lines in a speech about our work during this time, but I want to recognize the dedication and innovation of our program officers in concert with our embassies and consulates and our implementing partners who make it possible to keep the United States people-to-people engagement going during a time when everything else grinded to a complete halt. Today, I'm proud to share that the Department's public diplomacy exchanges have returned to our full slate of programming, and we will continue to utilize virtual efficiencies when appropriate. These exchanges began to shift from nearly 100% virtual to in-person and hybrid last spring, reaching a full slate of in-person programming at the end of 2022 calendar year. As always, the health and safety and welfare of our exchange participants are top of mind, and precautions were taken to do this in a safe and smart way to minimize any potential health impacts. A nation's power does spring from its people, and people-to-people diplomacy is the nucleus of not just U.S. foreign policy, but for all of the international community, as we saw in Berlin, in Johannesburg, and all around the world. Public diplomacy creates impact beyond the confines of government, a news story, or a political cycle. We meet people where they are, in classrooms, in concert halls, in communities and countries worldwide, to bridge divides and create lasting relationships that use education and culture and everything in between as a springboard for what's next. A business partnership, a global health discovery, a joint peace plan, and so much more. I'm not only hopeful, but I'm also determined that in this decisive decade, the future will be decided by people who come together, armed with hope and know-how, who seek more shared peace and prosperity, and who will build upon our core values of democracy and mutual understanding in communities and countries worldwide. Thank you so much for letting me have some time this morning. Sure. Happy to. Yeah. And if I could introduce, do you mind if I introduce some of the team that's here from ECA? Because during the Q&A, I might call on them to help answer some of the questions. So Michelle, would you please stand? Michelle Peterson is a Foreign Service Officer who's the Director of Policy and Planning at ECA. Jillian Duty, who is my Chief of Staff, who's worked with President Biden most of her career. Tally Sargent, who's the Director of Task on Communications and Press in my office. We worked together in the Obama administration. And Russell Solomon, who's also with us from Press and Communications and worked on the Hill, and we're so happy to have him here as well. So they're doing a lot of the hands-on day-to-day work. I just wanted to acknowledge and recognize them, and maybe we'll call on them to ask some questions too in a little bit.
Thank you so much, Lee. We'll turn to questions and become more casual over here. We'll take a question from the audience well, actually, I think we've got an online one I know about. And after that, we'll take a question from the audience. And if you'd like to, that is yours. We actually have a Public Diplomacy Council of America coaster to go with it for you.
Great.
Yeah, so Marcy, our tech host, will take the online question, but then if you have a question, thank you so much, Lauren, for coming up here. So we'll call on you next, and I'll go over here to help
Yes.
navigate.
Is it? Okay, perfect. So we will be fielding questions. Every other question will be from somebody online versus in person. So the first question is from Larry Schwartz. Countries around the world are expressing frustration with the United States because so many of their national antiquities are being stolen for illegal export and sale to American collectors. Why has the administration not taken emergency action to support theft from Ukraine? And can you please explain why ECA has executed few bilateral import restriction agreements in the 40 years since the U.S. enabling law was passed? Would you endorse the appointment of Special Envoy reporting to you to energize U.S. cultural protection efforts? And please let me know if I need to repeat some of that.
Okay, I think I have the gist. Hi Larry, if you're on, we worked together and I worked, this was already mentioned, during the Obama administration in ECA, and he was a distinguished public service officer. So it's nice to have you joining, Larry. I'm glad you brought up cultural heritage. I mentioned our efforts in cultural heritage briefly in the speech, but it gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit more about it. I'm so proud of the work that we do in cultural heritage. I think it is one of the least known about tools in our public diplomacy toolkit, and one of the most effective, to be sure. We're doing so much with Ukraine. I think one of the points that he raised was what we were doing with Ukraine. At the beginning of my tenure, it was right around the time the war broke out, and we came together as senior officials at ECA and thought, what else can we do to support Ukraine? With the need for, Ukraine was calling for more support for weapon and military, which of course is the priority, but we thought culture diplomacy should be brought alongside these important issues. And the war itself is about destruction of an identity, and that's culture. And so we put together a package and were able to secure some of the supplemental funds that Congress gave out. And we have about $9 million going toward support for Ukraine's culture to date. That's on top of our existing operational budget. So we were able to go out outside of that and ask for more funding. And so much of that has to do with eyes on the culture, destruction of culture that's happening during the war right now. And in fact, it got the attention of the cultural minister of Ukraine, and he contacted me, and our team have been in constant contact with him about how to support Ukrainians through the war, through culture, not only through storytelling and artists and those in the creative industry, but also through the protection of cultural heritage. So we've done a lot of great work there. I think he asked about a special envoy. We really already have that. It's the Cultural Heritage Center. It's headed up by a Foreign Service officer and a team of experts. They are archaeologists, anthropologists, they're scientists in their field. They work directly with countries all around the world to create the bilateral agreements that were mentioned in Larry's question. And I think that we've done an outstanding job in putting together more and more of those agreements. And those agreements, what they do is that they allow the United States to bring a whole of government approach to combating illegal trafficking of items that are stolen, often to fund terrorism or war, etc. And so we have law enforcement officials from the United States and in other countries to kind of come together and see how we can have a different approach to successes in combating illegal trafficking of artifacts. And we've had a couple of good successes. I'll mention one in Cambodia
where we were able to find some significant pieces that were unfortunately taken out of Cambodia, and a art dealer thought he was purchasing something legally, and when the evidence was shown to him, he returned those artifacts. And just last week, they were repatriated to Cambodia, and that goes such a long way in showing the important relationship and what the U.S. values in terms of cultural heritage and property. That was a long answer. I'm very sorry that I went on so long, but there's so much good work happening in Cultural Heritage Center. I would encourage everybody to go and take a peek on our website. And also, we just launched a partnership with Google. What's the Google app called? Google Arts and Culture. We just launched a partnership with them, and they're showing all of our where the United States has put money into preservation of important culture sites all over the world, and you can see those on Google Art and Culture app. So please go take a look. It's an impressive body of work.
Please introduce. Sorry.
Good afternoon, my name is Laurel Schwartz, and I am a columnist for the ChinaProject.com, and I also recently returned from working as a principal at Canadian Chinese schools in Beijing. I appreciate that you're here, and I appreciate that one of the things that you mentioned is the importance of the Fulbright program. As you know, the previous administration signed an executive order that ended the Greater China Fulbright program. What are the administration's plans to restart the China Fulbright program now that the pandemic is behind us and borders are reopened?
Thank you. I think it's important to underline how important people-to-people relationships and networks are, and you made that point right out of the gate. Whether it's a Fulbright program, our International Visitors Leadership Program, which Sherry mentioned at the beginning, that brings thousands of international leaders from all over the world, including China, to the U.S. to build relationships and networks and community with one another. It's more important than ever before, relationships. And we'll take a look at that, working closely with members of Congress and the White House and others to determine steps to move forward. But I think it's important to say that we're continuing relationships for people to people with China, even so now. Thank you.
Marcy, is there an online question? And then Mark, will go to you. Yep.
We have a question from Haley Pottle, a rising professional member of PDCA. She also works for USAID and is a United Nations graduate fellow. So her question is regarding public diplomacy efforts and its intersection with multilateral and the private sector. So what do you see as the role of entities such as the United Nations, as well as the private sector, in implementing public diplomacy efforts to not only enhance U.S. national interests, but also advance international development around the globe? And how is the U.S. working with the UN and private sector on global issues such as climate change, tech developments, and so on? Thank you. Another good question, informed audience. I'm glad that that was raised, because that's something that we also talk about a lot in the leadership team at ECA, that government can't nor should we do it alone, public diplomacy. Not even close. The private sector has got to be engaged in this effort around the world, and I gave Google in my speech, and I just mentioned again a relationship and a partnership that we created with them to do some of this work, but I could give you a long list of other external partners that we have created to do the work, because government shouldn't be the end-all be-all for how we bring people together. It includes academia, which is the point that we're here today. It includes the private sector, as the example that I've already given. It includes nonprofits, the UN, organizations like the Alliance that brings a network and a community of all of our implementing partners that run exchanges and do so much more. ECA, the programs that we do and implement, the exchanges, are a drop in the bucket. But when you bring all these partners together to look at the impact and the footprint that we're having around the world to make change and create lasting relationships, that's where we're really gonna make a difference. So it's through forums like this that we can bring together and collaborate that are gonna move the needle. I saw it in, speaking of the conversations I've been having with the Ukrainian cultural minister, when he was asking for help with the creative economy, and he was concerned that those individuals will leave and not come back, and who will be the storytellers and those that preserve and tell the story of Ukrainians for the future. So I brought together a group of art organizations from the United States, whether it was I think Philadelphia Orchestra was there, the Met from New York, Kennedy Center, and we talked about what each organization was doing to support artists in Ukraine. And ECA, through our funding, had a little piece of it, but then when you looked at it holistically about what all these arts organizations were doing to support, you could see a difference could be made. And so I would encourage more collaborations like that to be able to foster partnerships to get the work done.
Hi there. Hi,
Hello.
Assistant Secretary Satterfield. Thanks for being here and to share in the PDCA for this great event. My name is Mark Overman with the Alliance for International Exchange. I appreciate your partnership in calling us out there. For those who don't know, the Alliance is an association of US-based NGOs, the partners to ECA in implementing ECA's great programs. I wanted to build actually on what you were just talking about in terms of associations and community. You know from your time at Meridian, of course, how we on the implementing side advocate for, talk about the programs, to build them, grow them, both to Congress but as well as more broadly. So I'm interested in, now that you're in your current role, how do you see the advocacy that we might all do for the programs? I know you have to be careful about how you might talk about that, but what lessons are you learning now from the ECA government side, and any recommendations for us as a public diplomacy community for how we should be talking about the programs in what is, a challenging environment, a divided Congress. So any thoughts you have on that would be really welcome.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. And thank you for your leadership at the Alliance and all the good work that your organization does. I just spoke to the Global Ties national meeting. Do you guys know Global Ties? Okay. Amazing organization that does all the real work out in the field, as we say, all around the United States. And they mentioned that for the first time in 3 years, because of the pandemic, they were able to do their advocacy day, and they went up to the Hill and had about 150 of the Global Ties Network meeting with members of Congress, senators. They saw the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which is a powerful, important committee, and were able to talk to a number of staff about the work that they're doing locally. The more we can get organizations doing, so it's not just the Alliance, it's every organization participating and telling our story, the better off we're going to be in the long run. I think the best message we can send, from a domestic perspective, is that this work has significant bipartisan support. I like to tell people that I was nominated by President Biden to serve in this role and introduced at my hearing in the Senate by Lindsey Graham, my home senator. And
Proud of that?
sorry,
Are you proud of
that
that?
it was, I am proud of the fact that it is such a bipartisan, strongly supported effort of work that I would have that level of interest and support. And I think it speaks to the work that we do in a divided, more and more divided and divisive world, including in the United States. The fact that we can look at public diplomacy as a tool that Democrats and Republicans all agree is important is a pretty big deal. And I think we can talk about that, and I think that's something to be proud of and something that we should say and remind people of. it reminds me of one other example of a bipartisan, interesting opportunity. Mike McCall, who's now the chairman of the Budget Committee in the House, a member from Texas, just announced a bill called Peace Through Music Diplomacy Act. He was working on it for 5 years. He put it in the NDAA, and the president signed it in December. And it calls on us in ECA to build on the music exchanges that we currently already run and get more private sector involvement from the United States in supporting and promoting those who use music to bring about peace around the world. And it's just another good example of how we can find ways that we can come together to move the needle and make things happen around the world. Thanks.
We probably have time for one or two more questions, so if we could be crisp. Thank you,
Absolutely.
Matt.
Thanks for taking the time to come speak to us today. It seems that you've noted that.
Introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Matthew Wallen. I'm the COO of the American Security Project. It seems that you've identified correctly that public diplomacy is a strategic imperative and is more important than ever. And it seems that the Russians have figured this out as well. Not in that the Russians are being successful, but more that the Russians have figured out that U.S. public diplomacy efforts during the Cold War were extremely successful. They know our playbook, and they're actively working to shut that down. So they made things like exchanges much more difficult to accomplish. They've shut down our international broadcasting. What are you doing at ECA to try to combat this and try to break through where they're closing all the doors?
Yeah, that is the harsh reality of what's happening around the world. It's also interesting that more and more countries are taking a page out of our playbook and doing some of their own public diplomacy initiatives that they hadn't done before until they saw that it's a successful strategy. But the difference that we have now is that our values will outshine values of our competitors around the world. And when we lead with making sure that American values are what we represent to those who participate in exchanges, I think that'll be the difference maker. We've been saying all along that, I mentioned it in the question about Fulbright earlier, people-to-people diplomacy is about relationships outside of government. So we're doing all we can to continue to reach those audiences through these kinds of programs that get directly to people all around the United States through those organizations like Global Ties and the Alliance, who are doing all the real work to help our ambassadors build relationships with people that they've identified all around the world. So we're doing it in many ways through the exchange programs that we run right now and through our global public affairs officers at the State Department.
I think we have time for two more quick questions, and I want to sneak one in as well, which is, but how do you relate Assistant Secretary Satterfield to the new Office of City and State Diplomacy? And I don't know if we should take the other two questions. Why don't we let you have at that? Thank you for your patience. Your first name is?
Sunny.
Sunny, thank you.
Do you want me to speak to that first?
Yeah.
So does everyone know what Sherry's talking about? There's a new effort at the State Department to create an office of subnational diplomacy so that we can bring governors and mayors and others into the fold. We're actively introducing that office to our network and community. That office just spoke to and had a really amazing session at I keep mentioning the Global Ties session only because it just happened last week, and it was 3 days of a lot of good work, and that office came to that session and were able to meet directly with people around the United States. I think the best thing that we can do is not try to duplicate efforts, but try to use the network and the community we have to build on the work that's already taken place. And I think they are incredibly receptive to that and frankly thrilled that that community of people exists.
Sunny, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Sunny Sumter, CEO of the DC Jazz Festival.
Oh, cool.
And thank you for your work at Meridian, and I'm so happy that you're Assistant Secretary.
Thank you.
So my question is, with jazz ambassadors now that is now American Music Abroad, as a leader of a nonprofit that does vibrant work with embassies around the city. In fact, this month alone we have events with Cuba. Next month we have the Italians we're working with, and later in the year it's with the French and the Japanese. How can we be more engaged with American Music Abroad as a nonprofit? So many of us are great drivers to support this work. So what can we do, and how can we be more involved?
Awesome. Well, thank you for what you do. I think it's International Jazz Day next month, if I'm remembering correctly. Look at her, May.
I should have said that.
Yes.
April is Jazz Appreciation Month, and International Jazz Day is April 30th.
April 30th. See, how about me for knowing that? So stay tuned, because I mentioned the Peace Through Music Diplomacy Act that got passed through Congress, and I should have mentioned it was a Mike McCall had been working on it, but that was a bipartisan bill. I think Leahy, and I can't remember who the other members of Congress and senators were who sponsored that bill, but it was a bipartisan bill. And we're looking through that to build on a network to influence music. And so there are currently 4 programs that we run at State Department that are music. It's One Beat, American Music Abroad, what are the other 2? Next Level, which is a hip hop collaboration program. Center Stage, thank you, which brings international artists to the United States. So we're going to build on those 4 music programs and ask for outside groups to participate more broadly. So we're working on exactly what that looks like now. So stay tuned and be on the lookout. More to say on music. Thank you for what you do.
So we have one final question just to end. On a very light note, my name is Marcy Folk-Vados, and I'm the former PDCA graduate fellow. I'm currently at American Councils on the Nestle Y program, which is an implementing partner of PDCA, so thank you. Many of the individuals here are graduate students, rising professionals, and so just to end very nicely, what advice would you give to us who are just entering into the field, particularly women and minorities? What advice would you give to us?
Great question. I have 2 college students myself, and one is in international studies at the University of Pennsylvania. The other one I told you is now studying abroad in Barcelona. I get so excited when I see young people having a perspective about the world different from when I grew up. I never even knew. I'm from Greenville, South Carolina. I didn't know there was an opportunity to study abroad. I didn't really meet anyone from anywhere else other than my community until I was in college. So I get really excited when I see young people embracing the global community and trying to think about what you'll do in the world. I would say there's so many opportunities that you don't even know about yet. So take a minute to do the research. Taylor's nodding her head, and we work together at Meridian, and I'll call on her to speak to this as a student. What did she do to find out about it? And I asked her this when she started at Meridian. I was like, how did you find out? And I think that often we think about international relations or foreign affairs, and the PD world doesn't get as much attention as maybe some of the other fields in foreign affairs. And so I would say take a minute to look into what different types of fields there are that are related to foreign affairs, because you'll be amazed at what you unearth. I mean, to the example of the jazz nonprofit that's operating in DC, you might combine an interest. You might say, I'm a foreign affairs student, but I really love music. And you'll be amazed at finding a way to combine those 2 things. So I think I would just take time to do some research. Taylor, any other suggestions for students out there?
Look at State Department exchange programs. I'm also an alumni of the Congress Bundestag Youth Exchange for young professionals, and that's a really, really good insight into all the things that State Department and the broader public diplomacy field has
So check out our website for opportunities to participate. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That includes our Q&A for today, and I will hand it over to Joel Fishman.
Thank you, Marcy. Assistant Secretary Satterfield, thank you. We hope this is only the beginning. We look forward to your return at an appropriate time. You're on the hook. And we look forward to continuing work, close coordination with ECA as we work to underscore the importance of the Bureau's work and of public diplomacy in general. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate your time today.